The rain hammered against the kitchen window of our modest two-bedroom house in suburban Cleveland as I stood at the sink, my hands trembling while I washed the same plate for the third time. The words still echoed in my mind like a broken record, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. "You're worthless, Lily. Absolutely worthless." Those words had slipped from my husband Ben's lips just an hour ago, whispered with such venom that I actually stepped backward, my heart shattering into a million pieces. We'd been married for 8 years, together for 12, and in all that time, I'd never heard him speak with such pure contempt. The argument had started over something so trivial I'd forgotten to pick up his prescription from the pharmacy. Ben had been dealing with chronic fatigue for months, something the doctors kept dismissing as stress from his demanding job as a construction foreman. I'd been juggling 3 part-time jobs, cleaning offices in the morning, working at the local diner during lunch rush, and tutoring kids in the evenings, just to keep us afloat while his health issues made work increasingly difficult for him. I set the plate down and stared at my reflection in the dark window. At 32, I looked older than my years. My auburn hair, once my pride, hung limp and lifeless. Dark circles shadowed my green eyes, and my clothes hung loose on my frame. I'd lost weight from the stress of everything falling apart around us. Maybe he's right, I whispered to my reflection. Maybe I am worthless. The sound of Ben's coughing echoed from the living room where he'd collapsed on our worn couch after his outburst. It had been getting worse lately, the coughing, the exhaustion, the mood swings. The free clinic doctor had run basic tests but found nothing conclusive. We couldn't afford the specialists or extensive testing that might give us real answers. I dried my hands on the dish towel and walked into the living room. Ben was hunched over, his broad shoulders shaking with each cough. Despite everything, despite the cruel words and the growing distance between us, my heart still ached seeing him suffer. This wasn't the man I'd married. The Ben I fell in love with was gentle, supportive, always the first to encourage me when I doubted myself. "Ben," I said softly, sitting on the edge of the coffee table across from him. "Maybe we should try the emergency room again." He looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the old BAME, vulnerable, scared. But then his expression hardened again. "And tell them what? That I'm tired. They'll just send us home with another bill we can't pay." The financial stress was crushing us. Medical bills were piling up alongside our regular expenses. I'd been secretly looking into taking on a 4th job, maybe night shifts at the gas station, but I was already running on empty. "I'm sorry about the prescription," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I was running between jobs and... "Just stop, Lily." He leaned back against the couch cushions, closing his eyes. "I can't deal with your excuses right now." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood up, my legs unsteady. "I'm going to take a shower." In the bathroom, I let the hot water wash away my tears, but it couldn't wash away the pain. As I stood under the spray, I thought about my mother's words from our last phone call. "Honey, sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes you have to love yourself enough to walk away." But how could I walk away when Ben was clearly sick? When he needed me, even if he couldn't see it right now. That night, I lay awake listening to Ben's labored breathing beside me. He'd apologized before bed, a brief, "I'm sorry, Lil." I didn't mean it, but the damage was done. The words had been said, and they revealed something that had been building beneath the surface of our marriage for months. Around 3 in the morning, Ben's coughing woke me. But this time was different. I turned on the bedside lamp and saw blood on his hand where he'd covered his mouth. "Ben!" I shook his shoulder. "You're coughing up blood." His eyes flew open, wide with panic as he saw the crimson stain on his palm. "Oh God, Lily! Something's really wrong." For the first time in months, I heard fear in his voice instead of anger. I was already reaching for my clothes, my mind racing with everything we needed to do. "We're going to the hospital. Now." As I drove through the empty Cleveland streets toward Metro General Hospital, Ben slumped in the passenger seat, his breathing shallow. The streetlights cast long shadows across his pale face, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I'm scared, Lily," he admitted quietly, his voice so different from the harsh tone he'd used earlier. "I know," I replied, fighting back tears. "But we're going to figure this out." Despite everything he'd said, despite how worthless he'd made me feel, I wasn't going to abandon him. Maybe that made me weak, or maybe it just made me human. As we pulled into the emergency room parking lot, I had no idea that this night would change everything, not just about Ben's health, but about who I really was and what I was truly capable of. The automatic doors of the emergency room slid open, and we stepped into the harsh fluorescent lighting, not knowing that our lives were about to take a turn neither of us could have imagined. The emergency room at Metro General Hospital was a stark contrast to the quiet desperation of our home. Bright lights hummed overhead, casting everything in an unforgiving white glow. The smell of antiseptic and industrial cleaning supplies filled my nostrils as I helped Ben to the registration desk. The triage nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes named Patricia, took one look at Ben and immediately fast-tracked him. "Coughing up blood is nothing to mess around with," she said, leading us to a small examination room. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Ben's gurney, watching him answer the same questions we'd answered at 3 different clinics over the past few months. But this time felt different. This time, the medical staff seemed to be taking his symptoms seriously. Dr. Williams, a tall African-American man with graying temples, entered the room with a tablet in his hands and a grave expression. He had the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention, someone you instinctively trusted with your life. "Mr. Thompson," he said, pulling up a chair so he could sit at eye level with Ben. "I've looked at your initial blood work and chest x-rays. I need to be straight with you both. We're seeing some concerning patterns that suggest this might be more than just stress or a simple respiratory infection." My heart dropped into my stomach. Ben's hand found mine, squeezing tightly, the first tender gesture he'd made toward me in weeks. "What kind of patterns?" Ben asked, his voice hoarse. Dr. Williams turned his tablet around, showing us what looked like a chest x-ray with several dark spots. "These nodules in your lungs, combined with your symptoms and blood work, suggest we might be dealing with a serious condition. I want to run more comprehensive tests, a CT scan, a biopsy, and some specialized blood panels." The word, biopsy, hung in the air like a death sentence. I'd watched my aunt go through cancer treatment 5 years ago. I knew what that word usually meant. "Are you saying he has cancer?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't make that diagnosis without more testing," Dr. Williams replied gently. "But given the presentation, it's something we need to rule out. The good news is that we're catching whatever this is relatively early." Ben was admitted to the hospital that same morning. Over the next 3 days, he underwent a battery of tests while I barely left his side. I'd called in sick to all my jobs, something that would cost us money we didn't have, but I couldn't bring myself to leave him alone. The hospital room became our temporary world. I slept in the uncomfortable reclining chair, surviving on vending machine coffee and cafeteria sandwiches. Ben's mood swung between apologetic tenderness and frustrated anger, but I could see the fear beneath it all. On the 3rd day, Dr. Williams returned with another doctor, Dr. Angela Foster, an oncologist with short gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. My blood went cold the moment I saw her title on her coat. "Ben Lilly," Dr. Williams began, settling into the chair beside the bed. "We have the results of all the tests." Dr. Foster opened a thick folder and looked directly at Ben. "You have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's a cancer of the lymphatic system, which explains your fatigue, the respiratory issues, and the other symptoms you've been experiencing." The words hit me like a freight train. Cancer. My husband had cancer. Ben's face went white. "How bad is it?" "It's advanced," Dr. Foster said honestly. "Stage 3, which means it has spread to lymph nodes on both sides of your diaphragm. However, this type of lymphoma can be very responsive to treatment." I found my voice. "What does that mean? What kind of treatment?" "Chemotherapy, primarily. 6 months of intensive treatment. The survival rates for this type of lymphoma are quite good. When caught at the stage, about 70% of patients go into complete remission." 70%. It sounded both hopeful and terrifying at the same time. "There's another issue we need to discuss," Dr. Foster continued, her expression growing more serious. "Ben's case is complicated by the fact that he has a rare genetic marker that makes him particularly susceptible to certain complications from standard chemotherapy protocols." My heart sank further. "What kind of complications?" "Severe bone marrow suppression, kidney damage, neurological side effects. The standard treatments could potentially be more dangerous for him than helpful." Ben's hand gripped mine, so tightly I thought he might break my fingers. So what are you saying? That I can't have treatment? Dr. Foster exchanged a look with Dr. Williams. Not exactly. There's a newer, more targeted therapy that would be much safer for someone with your genetic profile. It's called CAR T-cell therapy. Instead of using chemotherapy drugs, we would extract your own T-cells, modify them to better fight the cancer, and then reintroduce them to your system. That sounds promising, I said, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in days. It is promising, Dr. Williams agreed. But there's a catch. For this particular treatment to work with Ben's specific genetic markers and cancer type, we need T-cells from a very specific donor match. Not just any match, it has to be someone with a rare combination of genetic factors. I felt confused. Like a bone marrow donor? Not exactly, Dr. Foster explained. This is more complex. We need someone who shares specific immune system markers with Ben, someone who's been exposed to similar environmental factors, someone whose T-cells would be most compatible with his system after modification. How do we find someone like that? Ben asked weakly. Dr. Foster looked between us, and something in her expression made my stomach flip. Well, we've already tested the most likely candidate. Who? I asked, though something in my gut already knew the answer. You, Lily. The preliminary tests we ran on you when you were here as Ben's emergency contact show that you're an almost perfect match. In fact, in my 20 years of practice, I've never seen compatibility markers this precise between spouses. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Ben's heart monitor. I stared at Dr. Foster, trying to process what she just said. Me, I whispered. Your immune system profile is remarkably compatible with Ben's. Your T-cells, once modified, would have the highest probability of success in his treatment. Without going into all the complex science, you're essentially his best chance for survival. Ben turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in months: genuine appreciation, maybe even awe. The woman he called worthless just days ago was apparently the one person who could save his life. What would that mean for me? I asked, my mind reeling. What would I have to do? The process is similar to bone marrow donation, but more intensive. We'd need to extract a significant number of your T-cells over several sessions. It's not dangerous, but it's uncomfortable and time-consuming. You'd need to be here several times a week for about 2 months while we prepare the modified cells. I looked at Ben, who was staring at me with tears in his eyes. Lily, of course I'll do it, I said without hesitation. Whatever you need. Dr. Foster smiled for the first time since she'd entered the room. I need to be clear about something else. This treatment is experimental and expensive. Your insurance will cover some of it, but there will be significant out-of-pocket costs. My heart sank again. We were already drowning in medical bills. How much? Ben asked quietly. Around $60,000, probably more. The number hung in the air like a crushing weight. We didn't have $60,000. We didn't have $6,000. But, Dr. Foster continued, there's a research program at the university that might cover most of the costs if you're willing to participate in a clinical trial. It would mean more monitoring, more tests, more time commitment, but it would make the treatment accessible. I felt tears streaming down my face, tears of relief, fear, hope, and overwhelming emotion. We'll do whatever it takes. As the doctors left us alone to process everything, Ben and I sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he spoke. Lily, what I said the other night. Don't, I interrupted. We don't need to talk about that right now. Yes, we do. He struggled to sit up straighter in the hospital bed. I called you worthless, but you're the only reason I might live through this. You're the only one who can save me. I looked into his eyes, seeing the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Ben, I would do this regardless of what you said. That's what love means. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Maybe not, I said with a small smile. But you're stuck with me anyway. As night fell over Cleveland, I curled up in the hospital chair beside his bed, both of us facing an uncertain future. But for the first time in months, we were facing it together. The next 6 weeks blurred together in a haze of hospital appointments, medical procedures, and sleepless nights. The clinical trial Dr. Foster had mentioned became our lifeline, not just financially, but emotionally. Being part of something bigger than ourselves, contributing to medical research that might help other couples in our situation, gave meaning to our struggle. The T-cell extraction process was more exhausting than anyone had prepared me for. 3 times a week, I sat in a specialized chair for 4 to 6 hours while machines pulled blood from one arm, separated out the T-cells, and returned the rest through my other arm. The first few sessions left me dizzy and weak, but I adapted. My body learned to handle the process, just like my heart was learning to handle the emotional weight of being someone's only hope for survival. Ben's condition stabilized once the doctors started him on supportive care to prepare for the treatment. The steroids they gave him helped with his breathing and energy levels, but they also made his mood swings more intense. One day he'd be grateful and loving, the next he'd be snapping at nurses or refusing to eat. I learned to navigate his moods like weather patterns, recognizing the signs of an approaching storm and taking shelter when necessary. Dr. Foster explained that fear and steroids were a volatile combination, and that Ben's personality changes were temporary and understandable. During one particularly difficult afternoon, when Ben had been argumentative with everyone who entered his room, I finally lost my patience. "Stop it," I said firmly, setting down the book I'd been reading. "Just stop." He looked up at me, surprised by the steel in my voice. "I know you're scared. I know this is terrible and unfair and overwhelming. But I'm here, giving everything I have to help you get better, and these people are working around the clock to save your life. So stop taking your fear out on everyone else." Ben stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. "You're different," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Stronger. More confident. Before all this started, you would have just taken whatever mood I was in and tried to fix it. Now you're calling me out." I considered his words. He was right. Somewhere in the midst of all this medical chaos, I'd found a backbone I didn't know I had. "Maybe almost losing someone changes you. Maybe being needed changes you too," he replied. The observation hit deeper than I expected. For years, I'd felt like a supporting player in our marriage, the one who managed the household, worried about the bills, and adjusted my dreams to fit around Ben's needs and moods. But now, I was literally irreplaceable. No one else could do what I was doing for him. 3 weeks into the T-cell collection process, I met another patient in the treatment center who changed my perspective entirely. Her name was Grace, a 60-year-old retired teacher whose daughter was going through the same process I was, donating T-cells for her mother's treatment. "The hardest part," Grace told me one afternoon as we sat side by side during our treatments, "isn't the cancer. It's watching the people you love sacrifice for you and feeling helpless to stop it." "But you wouldn't want her to stop, would you?" I asked. Grace smiled. "Of course not. I want to live. I want to see my grandchildren grow up. But the guilt is overwhelming sometimes." Her words made me think about Ben's anger and mood swings differently. Maybe some of his hostility came from feeling helpless, from having to depend entirely on others for his survival. That evening, I shared Grace's perspective with Ben. We talked more honestly than we had in months about fear, guilt, and the weight of depending on someone else to live. "I hate that I need you like this," Ben admitted. "I've always been the one who took care of things, who provided for us. And now you're human," I finished. "Now you need help. That doesn't make you weak, Ben. It makes you like everyone else who's ever gotten sick." By the 4th week, Ben's modified T-cells were ready for reinfusion. The process itself was surprisingly anticlimactic. Just in 4 bag hanging beside his hospital bed, slowly dripping what looked like ordinary saline solution but was actually a customized army of cells designed to fight his specific cancer. Dr. Foster monitored him closely for the first 48 hours, watching for any signs of cytokine release syndrome, a potentially dangerous immune reaction. I barely left his side, watching every breath, every heartbeat on the monitor. "You know," Ben said on the 2nd night, during one of his wakeful periods, "I keep thinking about what I said to you. About being worthless." "Ben." "No, let me finish. I was scared and angry and I took it out on you. But the truth is, I felt worthless. I couldn't work consistently, couldn't provide for us, couldn't even figure out what was wrong with my own body. I projected my feelings about myself onto you." I took his hand. "We both made mistakes. I let myself shrink to try to manage your moods instead of addressing the real problems." What real problems? I took a deep breath. Communication. Money stress. The fact that I was working myself into the ground and you never acknowledged it. The way we both stopped talking about our dreams and just started surviving day to day. Ben was quiet for a long time. If I get through this, he said finally, I want us to start over. Not our marriage, but how we do our marriage. What would that look like? I don't know yet, but I know I want to deserve the woman who saved my life. The treatment began showing results within 2 weeks. Ben's energy improved dramatically, and his follow-up scans showed the lymph node shrinking. Dr. Foster was cautiously optimistic, but warned us that the real test would come at the 3-month mark. As Ben grew stronger, I found myself struggling with an unexpected problem. I didn't know who I was when I wasn't in crisis mode. 4 months, my entire identity had been built around being Ben's caregiver and potential savior. Now that he was improving, I felt strangely lost. The realization hit me one Tuesday morning as I sat in the hospital cafeteria, waiting for Ben to finish a routine follow-up appointment. I'd been so focused on saving his life that I'd forgotten to think about my own. What did I want from life beyond Ben's recovery? What dreams had I set aside? What kind of person did I want to be in whatever time we had left together? I pulled out my phone and called my sister in Portland, the first time I'd reached out to family for emotional support rather than just medical updates. Katie, I said when she answered, I think I need to figure out who I am again. What do you mean, Lily? I mean, I've been so focused on being what Ben needed, on being the person who could save him, that I lost track of being Lily. And now that he's getting better, I feel empty. Katie was quiet for a moment. Do you remember when we were kids and you wanted to be a teacher? You used to line up all your dolls and teach them math. I'd forgotten about that dream. It had gotten buried under years of survival mode, of practical decisions and financial pressures. Maybe, Katie continued, this crisis wasn't just about saving Ben's life. Maybe it was about finding out how strong and capable you really are. As I hung up the phone, I realized she was right. The woman who had stood up to doctors, navigated insurance companies, endured weeks of medical procedures, and confronted her husband about his behavior, that woman was someone I wanted to know better. Ben emerged from his appointment with good news. His latest scans showed continued improvement. As we drove home through the familiar streets of Cleveland, I made a decision. Ben, I said, I want to go back to school. He turned to look at me, surprised. What for? Teaching. I want to get my degree and become a teacher. That would mean loans, and time away from work, and it would mean I'm building a life I actually want to live, I interrupted. Not just surviving, but living. Ben was quiet for several blocks. Then he smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile I'd seen from him in over a year. I think that's a great idea, he said. I think the woman who saved my life deserves to chase her dreams. 8 months after that terrible night when Ben first coughed up blood, I stood in front of my first classroom at Cleveland Community College, my hands shaking as I arranged papers on the desk. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long rectangles of golden light across the empty desks that would soon be filled with adult learners returning to education. I was teaching basic mathematics and literacy, not the career I'd originally envisioned, but exactly where I needed to be. These were students like me, people who had put their dreams on hold for family, work, or just the demands of survival. People who were ready to reclaim their futures. Ben was in remission. 6 months of monitoring had shown no signs of cancer returning, and Dr. Foster had gradually spaced out his appointments. He was back to work, but with new boundaries. No more 60-hour weeks. No more bringing work stress home and taking it out on me. We both learned too much about the fragility of life to waste it on old patterns. The first student to arrive was Maria, a woman in her 40s who dropped out of high school to take care of her younger siblings and was now pursuing her GED. She reminded me of myself, someone who had always put everyone else's needs first. "Good morning, Professor Thompson," she said, and the title still sent a thrill through me. I wasn't actually a professor, just an instructor with a bachelor's degree I'd completed through online courses and night classes over the past year, but to these students, I represented possibility. "Good morning, Maria. Ready to conquer some algebra?" She laughed nervously. "As ready as I'll ever be." More students filtered in. James, a veteran adjusting to civilian life. Patricia, a single mother of 3, Robert, a factory worker whose plant had closed. Each one carried their own story of resilience, their own reasons for starting over. As I began the lesson, I thought about how different my life was now from that night 8 months ago when I'd stood at my kitchen sink, believing Ben's cruel words about my worth. The woman teaching this class bore little resemblance to the person who had absorbed his anger and made excuses for his behavior. The transformation hadn't been easy. Ben and I had gone through months of counseling, both together and individually. We'd had to rebuild our relationship from the ground up, learning to communicate honestly instead of dancing around problems until they exploded. Ben had struggled with his own identity crisis as he recovered. Being forced to depend on others, especially on a wife he'd taken for granted, had shattered his assumptions about himself. He'd had to learn to accept help, to express gratitude, and to recognize that strength sometimes looked like vulnerability. The financial stress had eased somewhat. The clinical trial had covered most of Ben's treatment costs, and my new teaching position, while not high-paying, offered health insurance and stability. More importantly, I loved the work in a way that surprised me daily. After class, I drove to Metro General Hospital for my quarterly appointment with Dr. Foster. Even though Ben was the patient, she liked to check in with me too, monitoring the long-term effects of the T-cell donation process. "How are you feeling, Lily?" she asked as I settled into the familiar chair in her office. "Tired, but good tired. Fulfilled tired." She smiled. "And how are things with Ben?" "Better. Different. We're learning to be married to the people we actually are instead of the people we thought we were supposed to be." Dr. Foster nodded. "Crisis has a way of stripping away pretense. You both went through something that would destroy a lot of marriages, but you seem to have come out stronger." "We did destroy our marriage," I replied. "The old one, anyway. This feels like a completely different relationship. Is that a good thing?" I considered the question. Yes. The old marriage was built on assumptions that weren't true. Ben assumed I would always be there to absorb his moods without complaint. I assumed that making myself smaller would make him love me more. We were both wrong. And now we're building something based on reality. Ben knows I'm strong enough to call him out when he's being unreasonable. I know I'm valuable whether he validates me or not. We choose each other every day instead of just assuming we'll always be there. Dr. Foster made a note in her file. "Your lab work looks excellent, by the way. No lasting effects from the donation process. Your immune system has fully recovered." As I left the hospital, I reflected on her words about recovery. My immune system had recovered, but I had evolved. The experience of being literally irreplaceable, of being someone's only hope for survival, had taught me something about my own worth that no amount of reassurance from others could have provided. That evening, Ben and I met for dinner at a small Italian restaurant downtown, something we'd started doing weekly as part of rebuilding our connection. He looked healthy and strong, his color good, his eyes bright with the energy that had been missing for so long during his illness. "How was the first day of the new semester?" he asked, reaching across the table to take my hand. "Wonderful. Overwhelming. Scary. Perfect." He squeezed my fingers. "I'm proud of you." The words were simple, but they meant everything. For years, I'd craved his approval and never quite felt like I received it. Now, when he expressed pride in my accomplishments, I could hear it clearly because I was proud of myself too. "I got some news today," Ben said, his expression growing more serious. My heart skipped. Even though he'd been in remission for months, the fear of recurrence always lurked in the background. "Good news," he added quickly, seeing my expression. "Dr. Foster wants us to speak at a medical conference next month about the T-cell therapy program and what it's like for families going through the process. Both of us. She says our story is importante, not just the medical success, but the relationship dynamics. How couples can survive when one person becomes completely dependent on the other." I thought about standing in front of an audience of medical professionals, telling our story. A year ago, the idea would have terrified me. Now, it felt like an opportunity to help other couples avoid some of the pitfalls we'd stumbled through. "What would we tell them?" I asked. Ben was quiet for a moment, twirling pasta around his fork. "I think we'd tell them that crisis reveals who people really are, but it also reveals who they could become. A year ago, I thought I knew exactly who we were. I was wrong. Who did you think we were?" I thought I was the strong one, and you were the weak one. I thought I was the provider, and you were the dependent. I thought I was the leader, and you were the follower. He met my eyes. I had it backwards. You weren't weak, Ben. You were sick. No, I was weak before I got sick. I was weak when I called you worthless. I was weak when I let my fear turn into cruelty. Getting cancer didn't make me weak, it just revealed the weakness that was already there. The honesty in his voice still surprised me sometimes. The old Ben would never have admitted to weakness or fear so directly. And what would we tell them about me? I asked. That you were always strong, but you hid it because you thought that's what I wanted. That you were always valuable, but you let me convince you otherwise. That you saved my life in more ways than one. As we walked to the car after dinner, I thought about the couple we'd been a year ago, struggling financially, emotionally disconnected, taking each other for granted. That couple couldn't have survived what we'd been through. They would have broken under the pressure. But we weren't that couple anymore. We were two people who had faced the possibility of losing everything and discovered what actually mattered. We were two people who had learned that love wasn't just a feeling, but a series of choices made day after day, especially when those choices were difficult. 3 weeks later, I stood on the stage of a medical conference in Chicago, looking out at an audience of doctors, nurses, and researchers. Ben sat beside me, his hand resting supportively on my back as I spoke into the microphone. When my husband told me I was worthless, I believed him. I believed it because I'd forgotten that my value didn't depend on his opinion. I believed it because I'd made myself so small that there wasn't much left to value. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. But when Dr. Foster told us that I was the only person who could save his life, everything changed. Not because someone else finally said I was valuable, but because the situation forced me to act like someone who was valuable. And in acting that way, I became that person. I looked over at Ben, who nodded encouragingly. The woman who saved my husband's life wasn't a different person than the woman he called worthless. She was the same woman, finally given a chance to show what she was capable of. The crisis didn't change who I was, it revealed who I'd always been. After the presentation, several audience members approached us with questions and comments. A young resident asked Ben how he'd handled the role reversal of depending on his wife for survival. I fought it, Ben answered honestly. I was angry and scared, and I took it out on the person who was trying to save me. I almost destroyed the best thing in my life because I couldn't handle my own vulnerability. What advice would you give to other patients in similar situations? The resident asked. Ben looked at me, then back at the young doctor. Accept the help. Say thank you. And remember that the people who love you are choosing to be there. They're not obligated to stay just because you're sick. A nurse practitioner asked me about the physical demands of the T-cell donation process and how I'd managed to maintain my strength throughout the treatment period. The physical part was manageable, I replied. The emotional part was harder. I had to learn to advocate for myself with medical staff, to ask questions when I didn't understand something, to demand proper care and attention. I had to become someone who believed she deserved to be heard. As we flew back to Cleveland that evening, I gazed out the airplane window at the lights of cities passing below. Each pinprick of light represented someone's life, someone's story, someone's struggles and triumphs. Do you think we would have figured this out if you hadn't gotten sick? I asked Ben. He considered the question for a long time. I hope so, but honestly, I think I was too comfortable with the way things were. It took almost losing everything to make me appreciate what I had. I was comfortable too, I admitted. Comfortable being small, comfortable being overlooked. It was easier than risking failure or rejection. And now, I thought about my classroom, my students, the presentation we'd just given to a room full of medical professionals. I thought about the woman who had stood up to Ben's moods, who had navigated complex medical systems, who had literally given part of herself to save another person's life. Now I'm not interested in being comfortable, I said. I'm interested in being alive. Ben reached over and took my hand. I love this version of you. Good, I replied with a smile, because she's not going anywhere. As our plane descended toward Cleveland, I realized that the title of our story had been wrong from the beginning. This wasn't really about the moment Ben called me worthless, or even about the moment I learned I could save him. It was about the moment I discovered I had always been worth saving myself. The lights of Cleveland spread out below us like a constellation of possibilities, and I squeezed Ben's hand tighter. We were going home, not to the same house we'd left, but to the same address where two completely different people now lived. People who had learned that love wasn't about being needed, but about choosing to need each other. People who had discovered that strength wasn't about never falling down, but about who you decided to become when you got back up. 6 months later, Ben and I celebrated his 1-year cancer-free anniversary at the same Italian restaurant where we decided to speak at the medical conference. The waiter brought us a small cake with a single candle, and as Ben made his wish, I made one of my own. I wished for more ordinary days, more chances to choose each other, more opportunities to be the person I discovered I could be. As we walked home through the familiar streets of our Cleveland neighborhood, past the houses where other couples were probably having their own struggles and breakthroughs, I reflected on how much can change in a single year when you're brave enough to let it. Ben slipped his arm around my waist, and I leaned into his warmth. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on us when I gave up on myself." I stopped walking and turned to face him under the soft glow of a streetlight. "Ben, I need you to understand something. I didn't save you because I was selfless or noble. I saved you because that's what love looks like when you finally stop being afraid of your own power." He cupped my face in his hands, his thumb brushing away a tear I didn't realize had fallen. "I love your power, Lily. I love who you are when you're not afraid of it." As we continued walking home, I thought about my students who would be starting their second semester soon, about the lives they were rebuilding and the dreams they were pursuing. I thought about the other couples we'd met through the treatment program, fighting their own battles with illness and fear and the complicated dynamics of depending on each other for survival. Most of all, I thought about the woman I'd been that night in our kitchen, washing the same plate over and over while Ben's cruel words echoed in my mind. I wanted to tell her that she was stronger than she knew, that she was worth more than she could imagine, that the worst night of her life was about to become the beginning of her real story. But she would have to discover that for herself, just like I did. Just like we all do, when we finally stop waiting for someone else to tell us we're worth saving and decide to save ourselves. The house came into view, its windows glowing warm and yellow in the darkness. Home. Not the place where we've been slowly destroying each other with silence and resentment, but the place where we learned to build something better from the broken pieces. As Ben turned the key in the front door, I realized this was the real ending to our story. Not the dramatic moments in the hospital or the medical breakthrough that saved his life, but this quiet moment of coming home to a relationship we'd chosen to rebuild, day by day, choice by choice. "Ready for tomorrow?" Ben asked as we stepped inside. I thought about my early morning class, about the lesson plans I'd prepared, about the students who were counting on me to help them discover their own worth and potential. "More than ready," I said, and for the first time in my life, I truly meant it.